Well, it's a pleasure to be back at the National Constitution Center here in Philadelphia, and it's an even greater pleasure to be talking to you all about one of my favorite books of 2021, Charles Sumner, The Conscience of a Nation by Adam T. McEwen. This is a book that has been long awaited. You know, there are certain figures in American history about whom there have been relatively few biographies written despite the fact that they really ought to be household names, and that was certainly the case with Charles Sumner. When I began researching his life, the most readily available biography was a 1937 book called Charles Sumner and the Coming of the Civil War. And that was it. There were some articles here and there, but really no full-length studies of his life. That changes now with this magnificent biography by Adam Tameez. Charles Sumner was a United States Senator from 1851 until 1867. He was a leader of the anti-slavery or abolitionist movement, and he was also, in my view, the leading advocate of civil rights for African Americans during the period of Reconstruction, immediately following the Civil War. He was a member of the Republican Party, but he helped found that party in 1854, along with men like Theodore Parker and William Lloyd Garrison, the great and it was quite a remarkable career that he had. He was a lawyer by trade. He was appointed to fill an unexpired term in the Senate and then he was elected to a full term in 1852. But almost immediately, upon his arrival in the Senate, he was denounced by his colleagues for having the audacity to suggest that slavery was, quote, a great evil, and he was censured by the Senate for his views on slavery. It was during the 1850s that Sumner developed his most famous political doctrine, which he called the irrepressible conflict over slavery. And he argued that given the fundamental incompatibility between the institution of slavery and the principles of liberty and equality, there could be no lasting peace between the two. And therefore, he said, we must either have a settlement of this question of slavery or we must have a great crisis. And tragically, of course, his prediction came true. And just a few years later, he was at the center of the storm as the nation went through the crucible of the Civil War. But what I think makes him such a fascinating figure is that he was someone who was willing to speak out against slavery in a way that very few politicians were. In 1856, he delivered an address to the New England Anti-Slavery Society in which he said, I look upon the institution of slavery as a curse, moral and political, which threatens the overthrow of our whole political system. And he goes on, we must either have the equality of races or we must have the inequality of races. We cannot have both. It is a question of this sort that the Anglo-Saxon race is to be master race. If so, we must keep the African race in a serve-all state. If not, we must give to the African the rights of the Anglo-Saxon. Those are really remarkable words for someone to say in 1856. And yet Sumner was willing to say it. And he continued throughout his career to be a leading advocate for civil rights for African Americans. In a speech in 1866, he said, the right of suffrage is not the highest right of all. It is dependent on other rights. It is dependent on civil rights, which are prior and superior to the right of suffrage. You can't vote unless you are a citizen. And to be a citizen means to be entitled to all the privileges and immunities of citizenship in the several states and the federal union. So it's really quite something to have as our guide through this period of American history. Someone who is willing to speak out in such a courageous way. Adam Tameez is an associate professor of political science and law at a university, and he is the author of several books, including Theophilus, the Forgotten Black Founder, Who Shaped America, and the End of Equality. His new book, Charles Sumner, The Conscience of a Nation, is published by Viking.